The Odyssey by Homer is a continuation of the Iliad, and it tells the story of Odysseus, king of Ithaca's journey home from Troy after fighting in the Trojan War. Unfortunately, this journey takes about 10 years. Along the way, Odysseus takes many stops and faces many obstacles, the main ones of which are covered in this video, before he finally makes it home to Ithaca. The beginning of the book starts with Odysseus at Calypso's island, but that isn't actually his first stop. The Odyssey is mostly Odysseus retelling the story of his journey to the Phaeacians, so his time at Calypso's island is actually more towards the very end of his journey rather than at the very beginning. When he left home, Odysseus was probably not expecting to be gone for 20 years. He left behind his wife, his newborn son, and his beloved kingdom of Ithaca, but we hear about their struggles later in the epic. The first stop after Troy is Mykonos, where many men are killed even after Greek victory for not listening to Odysseus and basking in plunder rather than boarding the ship. So only a small percent of the men that were originally there continue with Odysseus on his journey home. After Mykonos, Odysseus and his crew find themselves at the island of the Lotus Eaters, which is completely populated with people high on lack of any ambition whatsoever thanks to the work of the lotus flower, a flower that acts as if it were a drug. Odysseus was wise enough not to try it, but a few of his men did, and they had to be dragged back onto the ship against their high, delusional wills. After that, they arrive at Cyclops' island. This chart shows the anger levels of Cyclops during Odysseus' visit. During this visit, a few men are eaten and then locked in a cave, so Odysseus blinds Cyclops and him and his men escape. Chasing the men down, Cyclops states his forgiveness because it was his prophecy and his understanding until Odysseus mocks him and ruins the whole thing, especially since Cyclops is Poseidon's son and they are traveling by sea. After this, Odysseus and his men find the land of Aeola, home of Aeolus, king of winds. The king manipulates the winds to get Odysseus and his men home and also gives him a bag of winds. Unfortunately, out of ignorance and greed, the men on the ship fear Odysseus is taking all the wealth for himself and while he is sleeping, opens the bag of winds expecting to find gold and instead are blown away from Ithaca, which was just in sight. As shown in this graph, although very wise and cunning, Odysseus does make quite a few mistakes, like mocking Cyclops and sleeping right when home was in view. These mistakes will continue to affect him throughout the course of the Odyssey. Meanwhile in Ithaca, Penelope and Telemachus struggle without Odysseus. Penelope is still hopeful, refusing to remarry one of the many suitors occupying her home. However, Telemachus, who has never really met his father, has a hard time believing Odysseus is ever coming back. Back to Odysseus, after returning to Aeolia and being dismissed and getting into some trouble with some giants, Odysseus and his men have now arrived at Circe's island. Circe is a beautiful goddess, however, unpleased with Odysseus' men, she turns them into pigs. Circe is unable to turn Odysseus because he is being protected by a gift from Hermes. Odysseus and his men actually end up staying with her for an entire year while preparing for their journey to the underworld. Odysseus originally travels to Hades upon suggestion to find out his fate, but he runs into a few extra familiar faces. This pie chart shows the percent of time Odysseus spent with each person in the underworld. He spent the most time with Tiresias, a blind man who could tell him his prophecy. He also sees Elpenor, a former crewman, Achilles, a former hero, and is surprised to see both Agamemnon, who was killed by his own wife, and his mother. Having got what he came for, Odysseus and his men leave Hades. After a brief trip back to Circe's island to bury Elpenor, Odysseus and his men now have to pass the sirens, evil creatures with beautiful voices. Understanding that no one who has heard the song has survived, Odysseus decides that if he could be the first, he would gain fame. After hearing their song and successfully passing the sirens, Odysseus now has to pass Scylla or Charybdis. He makes the executive decision to go with Scylla because he would have a greater chance of surviving that way. Back in Ithaca, as the number of suitors rise, the amount of food supply in Odysseus' home goes way down. Here, the x-axis also represents the chances of Penelope remarrying anytime soon. Back to Odysseus, one of the things Tiresias mentioned in his prophecy was that Odysseus and his men should never touch the cattle of the sun. Well, while Odysseus is sleeping, they do, and as punishment, Zeus kills them all with a storm. Now completely and totally on his own, Odysseus is trapped by Calypso, a beautiful goddess, and stays on her island for 7 years crying about how he can't get home. Luckily for him, he is pretty much in paradise, and this is the highlight of his journey besides winning the war and almost getting home. Throughout the course of his journey home, Odysseus gets lots of guidance from the Greek gods. The most guidance is probably from Athena, the goddess of wisdom, next being Hermes, a tiny bit from Zeus, and then Poseidon is actually under the bar because he did nothing but try to make Odysseus' life miserable. Hermes instructs Calypso to let Odysseus go, and Odysseus sets out on a raft. Poseidon, still mad about Cyclops, sends a major, super severe storm that is only survivable thanks to an immortal scarf given to Odysseus by Ino, a minor goddess. After surviving the storm, Odysseus lands on the island of the Phaeacians, where Nausicaa, a princess, takes him to her home where he has to prove that he is Odysseus. He tells his story of his entire journey home, and because congruent parts of congruent lives are congruent, they believe him, and they give him a ship to get home. Odysseus makes it home, reunites with his family, and kills the suitors in his house. Although it is not a happy ending for the majority of the characters, it is for Odysseus, for after 20 long years, he has finally found his way home to Ithaca. Just because the Odyssey is extremely old doesn't mean it doesn't make appearances in pop culture today. Odysseus is like the mold for many superhero characters today because he is one of the first ever heroes. He fights obstacles, makes enemies, but always finishes his missions in the end. The Odyssey makes appearances in our everyday lives like on cruise lines and cars and newspapers and movies and other sources that nod at the Odyssey's ideas and themes, and that is why, even being hundreds of years old, it is still relevant.